Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm happy to bring the conversation I had with James M. Bradley. James is the co-editor of the Martin Van Buren Papers, which is based at Cumberland University in Lebanon, Tennessee. He is an adjunct instructor in the public history program at State University of New York at Albany, and was the senior project editor of Encyclopedia of New York City. He is the author of the most recent book, Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. And that's what we talk about today. Martin Van Buren is the 8th president of the United States. And as some folks, longtime listeners will know, I enjoy U.S. presidents. And so I'm still committed to my goal of having a podcast on each president that's, critical and authoritative on each president. And some might get more than others or certain pieces. So really nice to get number 8 on the podcast. And can't think of a better person to do that than with James. We discuss how Van Buren built the modern political party system, which I thought was very fascinating. We talk about the background and upbringing of Van Buren, the influence of Aaron Burr, his temperament. He did so many things in New York. He was a New York State Senator, Attorney General, a United States Senator, Governor of New York. So we talk about all of his rise. We also talk about him being, in essence, a true first campaign manager of a political campaign for Andrew Jackson's presidential campaign. We talk about him as Secretary of State for Jackson, Van Buren's own presidency, his legacy, and many other topics. Van Buren is a fascinating figure politically, and I would say probably more so as a politician, what he did for politics, as in creating political systems, which is what James discusses in the book, even more so than his own presidency, which is again a very interesting component there. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, like, subscribe, share with your friends. Plenty of other episodes in the archives on U.S. presidents or this period of history. So check those out as well. And now I bring you James M. Bradley. I am here with James Bradley. James, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, certainly. You've written a very, very good book on a president most people won't know, and people that have listened to the podcast know that I enjoy presidents, U.S. presidents, and I actually did not know too much about our 8th president, so it was a lot of learning for me too. So I'm excited to get all into it. Before we do, just kind of give listeners a snapshot, just a kind of summary of kind of who you are professionally, academically, or otherwise, and what you're currently doing.
Well, my big qualification for writing this book is that I'm also an editor at the Martin Van Buren Papers. So I am working with a team of scholars and professionals. We are transcribing all of Martin Van Buren's documents, letters, correspondence, speeches, notes, 14,000 of them.
Oh, my goodness.
He
How long have you been doing this?
Very good handwriting. He got an F in handwriting, so that's a challenge. So on top of all that, so the documentary editing process, transcribing letters, organizing them in a way to make it easy for students and scholars to use them. We are putting them on a website, so we're digitizing them, putting them on a website. We're going to be doing letterpress versions as well. The annotation process is also a big part of our job. When a letter makes reference to a place or an event or anything that calls out for more explanation, we provide that. So we really get into the granular in terms of working with these documents. So that certainly gives me a big advantage in working on Van Buren's life. So I'm every biographer must read his subject's letters, of course, but I'm not just reading them, I'm transcribing them, organizing, annotating them. I'm involved on it in a really intense level. And I teach I teach this process, the documentary editing process. Everybody thinks of filmmaking when you say documentary editing, but this is the old school documentary editing, which is so I'm helping students learn how to decipher 19th century, 18th century handwriting because many young people are not taught cursive anymore. So it's almost like teaching them a new language, how to use
Yeah.
this material. Uh, so students who are working on their dissertations, I'm helping them with how to do research, how to use documents in your scholarship. So that's sort of my background. I've been a long time writer and journalist and editor. So all of that has prepared me for this moment.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's very. It sounds like meticulous work. When did it start, and when do you think it will end? What's like the timeline of the whole process?
The Van Buren Papers. Well, the Thomas Jefferson Papers began in 1950. Harry Truman was there to initiate this project. They're currently up to 1803.
Wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
They've
Wow.
got 20 years left of his life. So, but we're not the Thomas Jefferson Papers. They have
Sure.
hundreds of thousands of documents to work with. We don't like to put a timeline on things because you get into trouble when you say that. But we we have things we feel like that they're in order. We've got a real dedicated team where we've made a lot of great progress. So few years.
Yeah. That's incredible. Wow, that's some dedication for sure. Now, you've written this book, Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. So for listeners that don't know, Martin Van Buren was the eighth president of the United States. Obviously, we have the founding fathers that were the first 5, 6. Some people include Quincy Adams. Some people don't. Whatever. Yeah,
I wouldn't put John Quincy Adams in there.
Right. Some people do.
Yeah.
Some people don't. But anyways, so you get the first 5, maybe 6, whatever. But Andrew Jackson was really that kind of, first outsider kind of guy that became president, et cetera. And obviously, you talk a lot about him in the book. And so Van Buren is after him. And then we have a series of presidents that had some short terms and things like that. So anyways, Van Buren is really interesting. I guess the big argument you make in the book, which was fascinating to me, was that his kind of calling card here is he built and designed kind of our party system, and more specifically, seeing him as the founder of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And so I guess the question, you can talk about that, but I guess the question is how do we understand that, a little bit today where people they hate a two-party system. They hate, what the RNC or the DNC is now. And so obviously, people have, fallen out of love, I guess, with, party man and or woman and, a system like that. But what makes his legacy of building kind of political systems within the time, or party system rather, and what he did for the Democratic Party?
Well, regardless of whether people like the party system or not, there's no denying that parties are the principal engine of expression in American politics right now. That even people who are registered independents, who are not affiliated with the Democrats or the Republicans, usually vote for either one. We usually will identify with one of those two parties. So right-leaning independents will usually vote Republican. Left-leaning independents will usually vote for Democrat. Now, there's no denying that two parties cannot possibly represent the entirety of a nation as vast and as complex as ours. All the same, no one's been able to come up with much of an alternative to a party system. Now, I'm not talking about the two-party system. You can have a multiple party system. This is the way it is in most of Europe. Even a nation like Great Britain, they've got the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and they dominate UK politics. But there is the Liberal Party. There is the Scottish Nationalist Party. So there are these other parties in Great Britain who form coalitions. So they give the minority political views more of a representation in their government. Would America be better off with a more British-like system? Well, personally, I think so, and I think a lot of Americans would think so too. I'm not talking about the monarchy or anything like that at all. I'm simply talking about having two parties so firmly entrenched in America's political life. I can understand the great frustration a lot of people feel on this subject. So, putting that aside for one moment, the question of how did we get here?
Yeah.
Martin Van Buren's life gives us some clues, at least at the very beginning of this, because we had a little bit of a two-party system under George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Okay, historians call this the first party system. And it was the Federalists. The Federalists were George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. Republicans, and that's a loose term that some call them Democrats, some call them Democratic Republicans, which causes even more confusion. That's Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. But they weren't parties as we understand them now. They were more of what I call cliques or associations. They were not organizations with delegates and subordinates. They didn't really have conventions. They didn't have committees. They didn't issue platforms and statements and things like that. It was sort of a loose coalition of like-minded people. And when you called yourself a Federalist, well, that meant you more or less agreed with Alexander Hamilton's version of government. If you called yourself a Republican, well, then you agreed with Thomas Jefferson's vision of government. And that meant you would probably vote along those lines if you were a member of Congress, let's say. It was when Van Buren comes along, when he goes to Washington, that system has largely fallen apart. It's called the era of good feelings. These days, that term is used sarcastically more than anything else, because it was this idea of we were in a no-party system. When James Monroe ran for president in 1820, he was unopposed. He got every electoral vote in the nation except one. We were in this period of no parties, but factions were forming. And they were all calling themselves Republicans, but there was already one group calling themselves National Republicans. They favored a more proactive government in the nation's economy. And then you had the more hardline Jeffersonians who had a more laissez-faire view on this question. What did this lead to? It led to a four-man race in 1824. No one could possibly get the majority of the electoral votes that year. The presidential race went to the House of Representatives in a very controversial fashion. John Quincy Adams, who did not get the plurality of the popular votes, all the electoral votes, won the House race, and he was the president. So Van Buren comes along, and he got burned badly in 1824. He saw that if we're going to have this smattering of factions, we're going to see a lot of these presidential races decided by the House of Representatives. And it's going to engender a lot of controversy. It's going to be a possible breeding ground for trade-offs and intrigue and corruption. So he wants to have a more entrenched party system. He wants to rebuild the Jeffersonian Party that he remembered from his youth, but to give it more of a structure, to give it more of an organization, to even give it more of a personality, to work its way into the fabric of America's political culture. He also saw it as a way of building a stronger coalition between the North and the South, which at that moment was becoming increasingly frayed, especially over the subject of slavery. And Van Buren even used this term. It can unite planters of the South and plain Republicans of the North. So he envisioned a party system as one that would be a force for subduing sectional controversies, for keeping citizens more engaged in politics, for keeping corruption out of politics, that if there's a party system could be a check against the corrupt forces that were trying to use government for private gain. So this was his argument in the late 1820s. And that's when he sort of comes in and sees Andrew Jackson as the sort of figure who could galvanize the party and kind of galvanize the country. Sort of somebody who had the personality and the charisma and the military background he was a Washington-like figure, but who could embody Jeffersonian principles. So that's sort of how he remade the party system of its day. And no subsequent presidential races were decided by the House of Representatives. What happened in 1824 never happened again. So for all of the problems with the two-party system, and there are great problems, and you know about them as well as I do, it has been a stabilizing force in American life, that we have had uninterrupted quadrennial presidential elections. And I mean, that is an achievement. And it's something I think worth considering as we contemplate a vast continental nation as ours is, and what kind of role the party can play in trying to have some semblance of a peaceful republic.
Yeah, no, I think the context is important. I mean, people do this with the Electoral College. They do this sometimes with the Senate. They do this with the Supreme Court. They do. And look, I'm all for updating things and reforming things, but I do think that we have. Maybe it's not a perfect system. Maybe it's not the best system, but it is I think, on the whole, a good system that we have. And I think having parties such as the two major ones we have is important. I mean, kind of going into what you were saying, like, would it be nice to have a kind of parliamentary kind of system? Sure. Maybe.
But they have parties as well. Again, no one's been able to come up with much of an alternative to a multi-party system. Yeah.
So I think that there is something that is important there. So his contribution is incredible. And as the kind of the subtitle of the book, first politician, and I was a little surprised at this, and we'll get to it. But I mean, he really was a kind of very good political operative in the early part of the U.S. And
more than pretty good, I would say.
Yeah, right, right, yeah,
yeah.
So tell us a little bit, just background. Dutch family. He grows up in Kinderhook, New York, upstate New York. Give us kind of his familial, his contextual background growing up, and then kind of his education. He stops formal education at 14, which wasn't uncommon for the day. I understand, but he eventually did get through law school, passed the bar exam. So kind of give us the context of his upbringing.
Well, it's a great story. His upbringing. Only possible in New York, given what New York was like at this time. First of all, let's remember, he is born against the backdrop of the American Revolution. Okay, he is born December 5th, 1782. On the day he is born, King George III addresses the British Parliament and says, hostilities with the United States are now over. America is now an independent sovereign nation. We are cutting our ties off from the United States. This happens on the day he's born. So Kinderhook, the town in which he is born and raised, is one that was deeply, deeply divided over the war. Most of the Hudson Valley sided with the rebellion, but Kinderhook was a loyalist stronghold. However, his father, Abraham Van Buren, was not. He was a revolutionary. He was a patriot. And his tavern was sort of for the rebels in Kinderhook. That was their central meeting place. That's where the militia met. That's where our resolutions were debated. So his father kind of becomes a prominent figure in his neighborhood because he does take the stand, siding with the rebellion against the larger wishes of the most of the Dutch of Kinderhook. And he emerges from that sort of a man of some stature. What does that mean? Well, it means that he can play a bigger role in the town's political affairs. He becomes Kinderhook's town clerk. And this opens up all kinds of opportunities for his children. And four of his sons, would become lawyers. One becomes president of the United States. One goes to Congress. Very few people know this, that Martin Van Buren's brother, James Van Allen, his half-brother to be precise, he's elected to Congress. The other two are prominent lawyers in their community. So Van Buren grows up in this highly charged political environment. First, there's the passions, the raw passions over the revolution, which are not quite done yet. I mean, it would still take years before reconciliation really happens. And then there are the debates around the Constitution, the first party system. All of these things are taking place in Kinderhook. And Van Buren's really, the Van Buren Tavern is at the center of this. So we know that it's a polling site, his father's tavern. It's where trials for actual legal cases took place, because at that time there weren't enough courthouses in the state and the county to accommodate all of the trials that were taking place. So they were searching for alternative sites, and taverns were a frequent venue for this sort of thing. And if you're wondering, did they still serve drinks during the trials? The answer is yes, they did. It was controversial, but they did it. So, I mean, it was an example of what a strange and wild nation that we were in the early republic.
Mm.
So Van Buren emerges from this as somebody. His father, despite being a man of some prominence in Kinderhook, has problems with money, and he's not able to give his son the education that he wants. So he has to drop out of school at the age of 14, and he trains to become a lawyer. He didn't go to law school. There really weren't any law schools back then. But if you had a college degree, you only needed to do a few years of training. He did not have a college degree, so he had to do 7 years of training. But luckily for him, there was a family in the Kinderhook area, the Van Ness family, that had strong political connections.
Mm.
So they saw early on that Martin Van Buren was special. They could see he had these gifts for politics, these gifts for organizing. And at the age of 18, he goes to Troy, a city outside Albany, not too far from where I am right now. And he seems to play a really important role in getting his cousin, John Van Ness, the Republican nomination for Congress. He wins the race. When he wins the race, he arranges for his brother to give him a clerking job in New York City. His brother is William Peter Van Ness, who is close friends and probably the closest political disciple of Aaron Burr, who is the vice president of the United States. So all of these tremendous opportunities open for him, and he gets this extraordinary political education.
Mm.
Yep.
It's really interesting how he's kind of thrust in the middle of all of this, and he kind of rides the wave of all of this stuff. But it does seem like there's maybe with some of the stuff with his parents or with his other siblings that he sort of, I guess, develops or sees or knows that he has a kind of knack for this stuff, right? Like he's kind of good at this politics thing, which is really interesting. But that he has not only he has the opportunity, he has maybe the instincts for it and kind of the smarts for it, which is really, really interesting to see that. You mentioned Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr was the vice president under Jefferson, and infamously shoots and kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Aaron Burr has a lot of things. How much was an impact of Aaron Burr for Van Buren at the time, and then later kind of falls out with his ideas? So we could talk about this kind of evolution.
Yeah, well, it's enormous. Now, he goes to New York City in November of 1802. The duel with Hamilton is in July of 1804. Now, even though Burr is the vice president, and he played a large role in getting Jefferson elected president because he helps gives its electoral votes to Jefferson in the 1800 presidential race. This proves to be the difference in the campaign. But because of the weird balloting flute fluke. And the way presidents and vice presidents were not on a ticket per se back then, they both had the same number of electoral votes. And the race goes to the House of Representatives. And at first, everyone thinks, well, Burr will just distance himself and disavow any aspirations for the presidency. But he doesn't quite say explicitly he'll reject it. And this infuriates the Jeffersonians. There's several rounds of voting. Finally, the House does confirm his election to the presidency. But in the process, Burr really destroys his reputation and all of his influence with the president and his people. So he's a vice president, but he's kind of shut out of the administration's affairs. And he also loses a lot of power in New York. The Clinton family and the Livingston family, they had all been working together to elect Jefferson. They kind of separate themselves from Burr. But Van Buren still sticks with Aaron Burr because he's just a kid at this stage. I mean, he's not even, he's still a teenager, and he's in New York City. He's still studying to be a lawyer. He's living in a little boarding house on Catherine Street in Manhattan, an area that looks quite dangerous. So, but at the same time, he's getting this great political education from Burr and from William Van Ness, and he's learning so much about the law. Nevertheless, throughout all this, you can see Van Buren is moving away a little bit from Burr. Even though he likes Burr personally, he's learning a great deal from him personally. Clearly, he's seeing something he doesn't quite like, because in 1804, by now it's obvious Burr's not going to be running with Jefferson for president again in 1804. Burr says he's going to run for governor of New York. He runs against a nobody named Morgan Lewis. He's a nobody, but the big landed families of New York, the Livingstons and the Clintons, are behind him. And Aaron Burr looks more and more like a losing candidate. And that's when Van Buren, who's still 21 years old, he just gotten confirmation as an attorney. He can practice law in some of the smaller courts. He's not a fully licensed attorney yet, only an accredited one. He decides not to back Aaron Burr for governor in 1804. And the Van Nesses, who did so much to set up his political career, thinking he was one of them, they're furious. They feel betrayed. You know, they want nothing to do with them. They really disavow him after this. But Van Buren just thinks, hey, I'm just starting my career as a lawyer, and he's already thinking about a life in politics. He's not going to throw all of this away to get behind a campaign that's really not going to go anywhere. Everyone can see this from the beginning. Burr loses in the biggest landslide for a gubernatorial race in New York history at that point. We all know what happens. There's talk about at a dinner party in Albany, which Alexander Hamilton attended, that someone reports to Burr that the word despicable was used to describe him. Burr demands disavowal. Hamilton refuses to do so. They end their rivalry on a dueling ground in Weehawken, New Jersey, on July 11th, 1804. Now, what if Van Buren had remained part of Burr and his clique? His political career could have been over, because a lot of those people, like the Van Nesses, they had a hard time recuperating. William Peter Van Ness was indicted because he was the second in that duel. People who are associated with Burr really had a hard time living down their connection to the most notorious duel in American history. So Van Buren, he cut his ties at just the right time. So it was one example of how he had good judgment and even better timing. He had great luck earlier in his career, and this is one example of that.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. The timing definitely sticks out. I guess for him, as he's pretty young, 20s, but you say a few things sort of about his character and I guess his personality makeup. You mentioned that his professional rise was created by ambition, industriousness. And I guess I'm wondering, how did those components, you feel, kind of contribute to his rise politically, at the very least, as he comes from being a young guy to kind of more a bit seasoned? I mean, we can talk about his relationship with DeWitt Clinton and all of these things, but yeah, what do you think it was about him as he's kind of coming into his own that you really see this ambition and industriousness?
It's not just ambition and industriousness, confidence.
Mm,
I mean, the man's just sheer audacity was remarkable to me. I mean, just take this one example. I mean, the Van Nesses, they are mentors. They open doors for him. They get him into the vice president's mansion where he gets to meet with Aaron Burr and talk political strategy with him and learn so much. They practically build his political and his legal career. And then 1804 comes around and he just says, "Nah, I think I'm going to support Morgan Lewis. Sorry." I mean, we see lots of example of this where he just took these stances. And this was just early in his career. We see, uh, uh, even greater confidence and boldness of vision later in his career in New York politics.
hmm
So where did all that come from? It's hard to say. I happen to think his mother was probably an extraordinary lady. The Dutch families in the late 18th century were matriarchal by nature, and she
mm
was apparently a strong-willed woman. Uh, this obviously gave him the confidence to carry forward in his political career. And so all of these personality traits really played an immense role
mm
in facilitating his entry into New York's political life. But it was also because of the way New York was changing at the time, that
mm
lawyers used to be members of the elite.
mm
Okay, and they were that was slowly changing by the time of the early 19th century. The Republican spirit of Thomas Jefferson, that that the law profession and that people from other different backgrounds should be playing a part in our nation's political system. This was a powerful political philosophy, and it's why people like Van Buren really just adored Jefferson, and why they despised Alexander Hamilton so much, because they just thought of Hamilton as somebody who was on the side of the rich and the powerful, and that Jefferson was somebody who was trying to create these conditions that allowed the son of a tavern keeper, as long as he had the ability and he had the smarts and the work ethic, could carry himself in New York politics and in New York society.
mm
So it was all those elements coming together. And then, of course, finally, there's New York itself,
mm
which is really growing exponentially.
mm.
Uh, 1810 is when New York becomes the most populous state, in the nation. 1790, it was Virginia by far. So New York seems to really represent America's future. We have more immigrants moving there. We've got migrants from Massachusetts and other parts of New England who are heading west and settling in Western New York. New York is, thinking about building roads and canals, and all of this is designed to strengthen the state economically, and that economic strength would later translate into political strength.
mm. Yeah, he becomes a kind of big fixture of New York politics, kind of, again, right at the right moment. So, you can talk about it a little bit, his relationship with DeWitt Clinton, but, politically, the first big space where Van Buren is as a state senator in New York in 1812, right? 1813.
Mm-hmm.
And
1812.
and he's there for a little bit, and then he goes on to be attorney general, and there he's really overseeing New York in terms of state,
Let
county
me just
levels.
correct you. He remained state senator while he was
Oh,
attorney
he's doing it
general.
simultaneously. Okay, there's an overlap
Because
there.
they did this all the time in New York.
That's wild.
I mean, there were people who were federal judges, but they remained,
That's wild.
state senators. Yeah, so people having multiple positions was not at all unusual at that time. Yeah.
So talk about this space. I mean, he's really kind of right when New York is really growing and changing. He's kind of right there, state senator, AG. He's mixed up with Clinton. Talk about his kind of early goings, getting his footing there.
Well, this is the next big chapter in his life. After the whole blowout with Aaron Burr's people, he seems to settle down a little bit. He's a lawyer. He gets married. He starts a family, and he's doing very well for himself in Kinderhook. But he's taking on bigger cases. At one point, he gets behind a lawsuit challenging the legality of Livingston Manor, which is one of those land grants dating back to the 17th century that were done on pretty dubious grounds. So he's involved in this lawsuit, and all of this work captures the notice of DeWitt Clinton, who was then emerging as the political figure in New York. Now, DeWitt Clinton is someone who comes from a powerful, prominent family in New York, but it's not really a landed family. They accrue their power through obtaining political offices. So they sort of embody this new approach in New York at the time, where you've got, I already mentioned some of this, that you can hold a number of offices right now, and this gives you connections to employment. The more jobs you can hand out to people, the more loyalty you tend to win from them. So DeWitt Clinton, his uncle is George Clinton, who was the longtime governor of New York, and he becomes vice president of the United States under James Madison. You've got his father, James Clinton, was Washington's aide de camp in the Revolutionary War. He was a prominent figure in New York at the time as well. So he comes from this powerful family. He's highly educated. He goes to Columbia, first in his class. He's the sort of person who quotes great poets, who sort of make references to Greek history and things like that. He really kind of wore his learning on his sleeve. And he identified as a Jeffersonian, but he kind of, through his manner, kind of embodied that kind of 18th century ethos of the system of deference, that people should let their betters run the government. So DeWitt Clinton sees Van Buren. He wants him within his orbit. And Van Buren is starting to get interested in politics again and wants to move to a larger arena. Certainly likes having this powerful figure wooing him. So he becomes an ally of DeWitt Clinton. Clinton helps him win his state Senate seat in 1812. Now, this is a significant year on two fronts. June of 1812, America goes to war against Great Britain. It's a presidential election year. DeWitt Clinton challenges James Madison's re-election to the presidency in 1812. Now, this is a very controversial move that he makes, because a lot of Republicans in New York really revered James Madison, and they felt like it was bad time for Clinton to be making a presidential run, to be challenging an incumbent who was within their own party during wartime. And Clinton runs as an anti-war candidate. He thinks the war was not only a bad idea, but it was badly run. Van Buren supports the war, but he feels like, as someone who has worked with DeWitt Clinton, and the New York legislature, after a bitterly divisive vote, did endorse his presidential run, simply because they figured, we got to get behind one of our own. So Van Buren feels like he's got to go along with them on this, because he's a dedicated party man, and the party endorses Clinton for president, then he will endorse Clinton for president. His first day on the job, November of 1812, he goes to Albany. At that time, New York did not have a popular vote for president. It was the legislature that awarded electoral votes. So they determined this through the caucus. Van Buren, and I go back to these themes again, confidence and audacity. His first day on the job, he, with Clinton's approval, leads Clinton's campaign in the legislature. And through some really brilliant maneuvering, he gets the state to give all the electoral votes of New York, the most in the nation, to Clinton. He obviously loses the race. James Madison is reelected. But the race is a lot closer than people were expecting. In fact, if Pennsylvania had voted for Clinton, he would have been the fifth president.
Pennsylvania in American presidential elections being important. I've never heard of that before.
Right? Well, let me tell you something. I never know this till I was writing on the book. They call it the Keystone State. That's why. Because it was considered the keystone to political future.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. So it's always been this crucial state in American politics. That's how it got its name, the Keystone State. Despite Van Buren's success and Clinton's happiness with everything he's done for him, again, very similar to Aaron Burr, he starts to move away from Clinton. He sees Clinton's arrogance, his haughtiness, his bossy nature, his didactic nature. He sees him as somebody who's really not the person to lead New York as it's going through all this tremendous upheaval at the time politically. And, he also it's more than just he didn't like him personally. Clinton was wooing Federalists in his presidential run because there really wasn't a Federalist candidate for president that year. Clinton was sort of the de facto Federalist candidate. So he's working with Federalists to try to build political power. And to Van Buren, this is really a heresy because the Federalist Party, in his view, these were the forces who were trying to prevent people like him from participating in the democratic process. So there's a series of events. A lot of them are based on misunderstandings. Some of them are based on events that no one saw coming. But Van Buren has a clean break from DeWitt Clinton in around 1815 at the conclusion of the War of 1812. And Clinton seems to be someone whose presidential run really destroys his political career. But he would rebound, and he would rebound in spectacular fashion. And for the next, 9-10 years, New York politics is defined by the rivalry between DeWitt Clinton and Martin Van Buren. It's a tug of war, push and pull that goes back and forth. Again, for this decade-long period. And it's an extraordinary story because it just shows you how incredibly volatile and fickle politics was back then. I know what you're thinking, unlike now, of course. But yeah, there really was this, where someone would just look like their political career is over. And before you know it, they were back on top again.
Yeah, nothing changes. Nothing changes.
A number of people who read the book said that they feel like what I'm writing about could be written about today.
Well, this is why when people start sensational, we've never had a time. I'm like, it's different, but at the same time, it's not.
Yeah. I like to quote a historian I admire much named Adam Rothman. His line is, "We live in precedented times."
That's a great quote. That's
well said.
That's a great quote.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing that is interesting is that Van Buren's trajectory is just kind of moving up, but he's, as you're saying, he seems to know. He starts to really get, at least within New York politics, and then we see how he does this on the New York on the national stage, knowing timing, when to do things, when to kind of push for this person, when not to, etc. It seems like he's you can correct me here, but it doesn't seem like he has like big goals, like I'm going to be president and that's where this is all leading to necessarily. I mean,
Right.
he's working kind of, with other people that are in the forefront, but he does become U.S. senator, and you can talk about that, but then also he has this brief, and this is right before the Jackson administration, which I want to get to. But he has this brief period where he's governor of New York. So talk about being U.S. senator, and then he's briefly governor of New York, right? What's this about here?
Yeah. Okay. He is elected to the U.S. Senate in 1821. Now, at that stage, senators were not elected through popular vote. It was through the legislature. And Van Buren's people are in complete control of the legislature. And at that time, he felt like he had New York and New York's government under control. And he wanted to bring the party discipline that he had brought to New York, he wants to bring it to Washington because, as I was saying earlier, this is the era of good feelings. This is the beginning of James Monroe's second term. And a lot of the more doctrinaire, orthodox Jeffersonians in Congress are unhappy with James Monroe because Monroe has more of an anti-party view of government. And at that time, they want to see a more strident party system in place. So Van Buren goes to Washington and he realizes something that he's just one man, of course, and he's a freshman senator. He can't expect to just upend everything right away. So he works on building friends, and what he's doing most is cultivating relations with the South. He forms a lot of close relationships with senators and congressmen from Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia and South Carolina. He meets John C. Calhoun. But when he gets there, everyone's talking about the presidential race of 1824. And there are four big candidates who emerge. Okay, it's John Quincy Adams, it's Andrew Jackson, it's Henry Clay, and it's William Crawford. Now, those first three names, everyone knows. William Crawford, though, is a pretty obscure figure. You really have to know your U.S. history to know who Crawford was. Here's the thing. He was the front runner in 1824. Why? Because he was this prominent figure in the Monroe cabinet. And he had been a prominent cabinet member for some time. And the cabinet was where the center of power was in American politics. So he was the Secretary of the Treasury, which means he knew everything about money, and that helped with the financing of the election. He was also previously Secretary of War, and he was the ambassador to France. So his foreign policy credentials were impeccable. And he also had strong relations with Congress, and that's who decided how nominations were decided. It was something called the Congressional Caucus. Now, just as it took place in New York with DeWitt Clinton, that was on the New York legislature. It was something very similar in Washington. So the caucus system made sense when you had Federalists and Republicans. But what do you do when you've got four candidates running and they're all nominally Republicans? And furthermore, they're from different regions of the country. You've got John Quincy Adams from New England. You've got Henry Clay from Kentucky. You've got Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, and you've got Crawford from Georgia. And also, I should point out, John C. Calhoun was a candidate. I mean, he had to drop out early when he realized he wasn't getting anywhere, but his hat was in the ring too, and he was from South Carolina. So you had someone from the West, someone from the deep South, someone from like a Southwest kind of border state. You got John Quincy Adams from the North. A caucus system is never going to work. Most people boycott the caucus. Van Buren, in one of the fateful mistakes of his early career in Washington, endorses Crawford. He thinks Crawford is the man to sort of bring greater harmony between the North and South that had been frayed because of some explosive recent events like the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri debate, which was something that started in a New York congressman started it when he said Missouri can't be a slave state. And that made the South more defensive, more militant. And they thought, okay, if the North is going to start coming after us over slavery, we've got to play a more proactive role in presidential politics. So Van Buren sees Crawford as the kind of figure who can unite these two sides that are quarreling in many ways. New York doesn't see it this way. This issue of why New York is always playing second fiddle to the South. It had been a sore point for some time. 1816 is when you really heard people saying, "We're the biggest state in the nation. Why do we keep electing Virginians president?" Now Crawford was from Georgia, not Virginia, but he was still a Southerner, and he was born in Virginia, so it was pretty much the same thing to them. Most of New York reacts overwhelmingly negatively toward the Crawford dominance. And Van Buren's role in this, and they're saying, we sent you down to Washington to represent us, and what are you doing? You're backing this guy Crawford. There's this big revolt that takes place in New York. They don't want one politician deciding how their state's going to vote for president. They want to give that choice to the people. A new political party comes up out of nowhere, and they're called the People's Party. And guess who runs for governor on the People's Party? DeWitt Clinton. And on top of all this, the Erie Canal is coming toward completion. And the Erie Canal was DeWitt Clinton's brainchild. So Van Buren thought that DeWitt Clinton was dead and buried, and yet he rises again because of his inept handling of the 1824 presidential race. And by the way, I should point out, Crawford also has a devastating stroke in October of 1823. And Van Buren, to me anyway, pretty much lies to people and says, he's okay. Was nothing serious. He's going to rehab. He's going to be himself in no time. When in fact, it was a very serious stroke. Crawford had a great difficulty walking and talking. He was in absolutely no condition to be president of the United States. So the 1824 race, as I mentioned, it goes to the House of Representatives. No one gets a majority. Crawford does terribly. Adams is the next president. DeWitt Clinton returns to the governor's chair, and Van Buren has to rethink everything. He goes to Washington riding high in 1821. 4 years later, everything has fallen apart. So that's when he decides to rebrand himself. Well, I feel like I'm going a little too far here. Is there anything you want to ask me? No. Should I keep going with this?
Keep going. Yeah.
Okay. He decides not long after the 1824 race that he underestimated Andrew Jackson, that Jackson had this grip on the American psyche on ways that he just simply didn't understand. Now, a lot of Republicans of Van Buren's ilk, his kind of faction, they distrusted military men. They didn't believe that a military leader was necessarily the best kind of person to be president because Andrew Jackson, had this reputation for being a hothead, for being impulsive and a gung-ho type, and they wanted a dedicated party man to be president. And Andrew Jackson was somebody who openly disdained political parties in his early career in Washington at that time. So Jackson was unacceptable to Van Buren and the Crawford people. He completely changed his course at the 1824 race, and he realizes that Jackson is this rare figure, somebody who could project strength, who had this sort of flair and dynamism of a Washington, and at the same time, they could mold him into also combining those with the principles of Thomas Jefferson. So there was the first time where I think we had a prominent political figure who was looking to change the image of a candidate and to sort of build greater coalitions around someone's campaign. So he travels around the South and he meets with all of these Crawford people, Calhoun people, and he says to them, I get why you find Jackson distasteful. I get all that. But think of the alternative. Right now, we've got John Quincy Adams president. We've got to defeat him. And he says to them, Jackson is the way he is because he's been exposed to the military life for so long. Early in his career, though, he wasn't necessarily like this. People forget, but in the late 1790s, he was briefly in the House and in the U.S. Senate. So he just thought with the right guidance, with the right cajoling, you could say, or urging, he could sort of bring him back to his kind of Jeffersonian roots. And it's a big success. He goes down south, he meets with all these people, and slowly the support for Jackson builds. And this really blossoms into a full-fledged presidential campaign. He's Jackson's campaign manager. This is something that John Quincy Adams writes in his diary. He calls him the great electioneering manager for Andrew Jackson. And the 1828 campaign really shapes up to be the first modern presidential campaign in U.S. history. It's the first one where you see a real party system in place as parties as we understand them today. Now, there wasn't a convention. He wanted a convention. They couldn't pull it off, mostly because people just thought, if we've got a convention, they're going to show how much we don't agree. So it was interesting that they realized that they weren't quite ready to have a nominating convention, but at the same time, they could work on the partisan press, presenting an image of Jackson to the public. They even had him do a little campaigning. There was a celebration in New Orleans to commemorate the Battle of New Orleans. And they went down there and there were parties and there were barbecues and there were all these festive events taking place. And Jackson did some public speaking. He wasn't saying vote for me for president, but the idea of getting a president out there before the people was something that was a novelty. So it has all of the common features of a presidential campaign as we understand it today. There's a lot of mudslinging. There were all these sorts of stories in the newspapers about John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. A lot of them were just really stretching the truth in so many ways. So it's something that Van Buren, he was the treasurer of the campaign. He was raising money, using Congress to push forth an agenda that would promote the Jackson campaign. So it was a big change in how campaigning was done in America. And in 1828, Jackson wins in a landslide. Jackson takes almost all of the country except for a little corner of New England, which sticks with John Quincy Adams. But let me go back to New York for one moment, because at the same time, he's got to handle New York, because New York is still divided over Jackson. He makes peace with DeWitt Clinton. He realizes we are fighting so much that we are hurting New York's standing in the national scene. They agree to both support Jackson in 1828. I can say this because it's happened 2 centuries ago, but then a wonderful stroke of luck takes place for Martin Van Buren. DeWitt Clinton drops dead one day. In February of 1828, he's in his study with his 2 sons, and just like that, he keels over and dies. DeWitt Clinton is no longer a problem for him. But there's a new problem in New York, and it's called the anti-Mason movement. It's hard for Americans to kind of understand and appreciate this, but the organized Masonry was to many people, a growing threat in American society at the time. And when there was this case of a guy named William Morgan, who was denied entrance into a particular Masonic order out in Buffalo, he said, I'm going to expose all the secrets of the Brotherhood of the Masonry. And he disappeared. And then his body showed up on the shores of Lake Ontario, and they confirmed that the body was his. This produced an enormous backlash. And there was an anti-Mason party in New York that just, much like the People's Party emerged in 1824, 1828, it looked like the anti-Masons were going to upset the balance in New York. That's when Van Buren decides, okay, I will run for governor of New York myself. He barely wins. He wins the race. Jackson wins his race. And Jackson offers him the most prominent spot in his cabinet, Secretary of State. And Van Buren says, sure. He was just elected governor of New York. He finishes a couple of months as governor, passes some key legislation, and then he resigns and goes to Washington, and he's Secretary of State.
It's such an incredible story. I'll go back to the thing about the election. I mean, it did in reading it. It did feel. I've read about Jackson previously, but reading it from Van Buren's perspective, really as like a kind of campaign manager, felt like the first kind of presidential campaign, and the rebrand and the selling it and selling him, and I mean, it doesn't feel too dissimilar to how we do things today, right? It feels very, very, very familiar, and it was really interesting to see, how, he was able to do that. And there's been some really prominent campaign managers, in recent history, which, some of them get really, good credit, as they should. It's someone can be great, or they could be a good speaker, or they could have good policies, but you kind of have to get a campaign well, right? And we obviously have experiences where people don't campaign well, even though they have good idea, or vice versa. So it's an important feature, which is interesting. I guess. Interesting. He becomes Secretary of State under Jackson. This will be, I think, helpful. Jackson's there for 8 years. He has scandals, things like that. But I guess how much daylight was there on policy and worldview between Van Buren and Jackson on things such as tariffs, Indian removal, slavery? There's a lot of things that happened in the Jackson administration. Now, Van Buren is Secretary of State, which is, there's his interactions with United Kingdom or Britain, I should say. But how much, in terms of, obviously they have different temperament, but in terms of their worldview or their policy, was there a lot of difference? Were they pretty similar?
No.
What was it like?
No, I don't think there was a lot of daylight between them. I think you just hit the nail on the head. The biggest difference was simply in temperament, strategy. They really did complement one another. Van Buren could be overly cautious, and Jackson was somebody, and this was later in his presidency when Van Buren wanted to run. Jackson was somebody who could push him to take some bolder stances. But early on, Van Buren saw himself as a moderating influence in the Jackson administration, that he could quell some of Jackson's more impulsive tendencies, his hot-headedness. He would encourage him to form more conciliatory relations with members of Congress, and certainly with the diplomatic corps. So that was really the big difference between them right now. And I think Jackson appreciated this. Jackson was a hothead and he was impulsive, but he was also capable of introspection. And I think he recognized that on a lot of occasions, Van Buren was right. Van Buren would sit him down and say, you can't do things this way. And he would say, yeah, I see what you're saying. So he appreciated that.
It sort of pushes on that notion, of, North and South, Union, whatever. Jackson was from Tennessee, and, Van Buren's from upstate New York. There's, you can be from different parts of the country and have similar ideas and policies and worldviews. It's not always this kind of North-South, split. Definitely we see that, I guess, grow during the Civil War and afterwards. But, it's very interesting how people can be from different parts, different subcultures, things like that, but it's still kind of, commiserate on certain things. Give us the story here of, you can start bringing this into, his positions on, the whole bank affair of, the dominated Jackson and into Van Buren's presidency as well. But how was he as Secretary of State? And then Jackson finally taps him on the shoulder and says, hey, come be my vice president for term 2. And how does that kind of propel him into his own presidency? Kind of give us this arc here.
Well, he's a very good Secretary of State. He's good on a number of fronts. He's good in his personal interactions with his fellow diplomats, with the ministers who are based in Washington. This is a different world, of course. They don't have subordinates doing everything. It was really one-on-one. So Van Buren is in Washington. The ministers from all the great European powers, they're based in Washington. So Van Buren learns the art of the dinner party and just one-on-one dinners and socializing with them in ways where this sort of schmoozing that he always did very well in New York, and this goes back to his training as a lawyer. He likes the whole style of diplomacy. He's very good at it. So on that front, he's a very effective Secretary of State. The Jackson administration, the first 2 years are bogged down in this really absurd scandal called the Peggy Eaton affair.
Yeah.
It's almost extraordinary when you tell people about it right now. But after Andrew Jackson is elected president, but before he is inaugurated, his wife dies. His beloved wife, Rachel, dies December 22nd, 1828. He blames the Adams people. He blames Henry Clay for her death because there were stories. There was a lot of mudslinging going on about her and her marital history and her first marriage. They called her a bigamist and things like that. And he believes that all of that contributed to her early death. Early, she was in her 60s. But she had a weak heart for some time. So that was probably what was the cause of her death. But she has a heart attack. She dies. So Andrew Jackson goes into the presidency, really a broken man. And he cannot bear a long, drawn-out process for seeing his cabinet picks confirmed by the Senate. So he gives a lot of the responsibility to his Tennessee people, including one of his closest aides, Tennessee Senator named John Eaton. He makes him the Secretary of War. John Eaton, on January 1st, 1829, months before Jackson's about to take office, marries Margaret O'Neill Timberlake, who is a former barmaid from her father's saloon in Washington, D.C., and she is a recent widow. Her husband, John Timberlake, was a Navy man who died out in sea a few months earlier. But all of Washington believed that he took his own life because of her indiscretions. That she was someone who was known to go around Washington with some powerful people, including John Eaton. So Washington society formed this judgment of her, that she was a woman of ill repute and not fit to be a wife of one of the cabinet. And the wives of the other cabinet members rebelled, and they refused to see her, and they boycotted events where she was there. And Jackson was furious because he sees they are treating her the way they treated my wife, and that led to her death. So this becomes a really personal issue with Jackson. And the first 2 years of his administration, he's not able to get a whole lot done because his entire administration is paralyzed over what they were calling the petticoat affair. That was John Quincy Adams' term for it. And through all this, he forms a very close alliance with Van Buren because Van Buren is a widower at this stage. His wife had died in 1819. So he doesn't feel any spousal pressure to call upon Mrs. Eaton the way some other cabinet members do. Jackson sees him as his one true friend. This is where Van Buren comes to Jackson's rescue. He says, I think I know a way out of this for you. I'm going to step down as Secretary of State. And if I step down, that will give you the opportunity to ask the other cabinet members to step down. You can form a whole new government, and this whole controversy will be over with. Jackson refuses at first, but he agrees to it on one condition. If Van Buren stays on but he's going to go far away. They make him minister to Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
He goes to Great Britain. The plan works beautifully. They all step down. Jackson builds a new cabinet, gets to start anew, and he's more grateful to Van Buren than ever because he sacrificed so much to save my administration. That's how he sees it. He goes to England. He plans to finish his tenure as minister to Great Britain, and then he's going to return to the United States and probably resume his law practice in Albany. This is where his whole life takes this incredible turn. In the Senate, Henry Clay leads this opposition to defeat his vote for minister to Great Britain. And they engineer it in a way where it's going to be a tie. Who breaks the tie? Andrew Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun votes against Van Buren. His nomination sinks. Calhoun soon resigns as vice president. And what they do in the process is they make Van Buren out to be a martyr, that they are someone who did this very petty and vindictive thing by crushing his ministership appointment to Great Britain. And in the process, they make him the vice presidential candidate in 1832. Jackson wins a big re-election. Van Buren is now the vice president of the United States, and he's set up as kind of the heir apparent for 1836. So, and what looked like his career was coming to an end, it was revived because of the machinations of his enemies who did this act that engendered enormous public sympathy for Van Buren within the Democratic Party, and they made him vice president, which was something no one was discussing earlier in the year, and now they made it a certainty.
Again, his timing is amazing, and he's quite the shrewd politician. He really is able to really maneuver through all of these things. It's especially I mean, people have written about the Jackson presidency, so it's an interesting time.
Yeah.
So tell us, I guess, about his presidency. So he's president for 4 years. A lot of things go on. So just give us the snapshot, I guess, of the banking crisis, that whole thing. And, he kind of gets it from Jackson. He has to deal with it, kind of burns him a little bit. And then I guess you can tell us about he continues Jackson's Indian removal policies, big removal in 1838.
Yep.
Tell us about these kind of two things, I guess.
Okay, well, you were asking about daylight in their approaches to policy and government. This was one area where they had a little bit of a difference, and that had to do with the world of banking. Van Buren was much more pragmatic on these things, whereas Jackson had this powerful, visceral dislike for the Bank of the United States and its president, Nicholas Spittle, and he saw banks as this destructive force in American life, and he saw paper money as being this destructive force in American life. So he succeeds in he vetoes the renewal of the Bank of the United States charter. So, and on top of that, he removes all the deposits out of the bank and he disperses it in a series of state banks throughout the country. And in around 1837, when Van Buren's about to be inaugurated as president, we see the beginnings of a financial crisis brewing. It starts when Great Britain realizes it's kind of over-leveraged in the United States and it needs to withdraw its credit because he also believes that the United States is there's Andrew Jackson's economic policies had led to an enormous move of capital out west, and a lot of the Eastern banks were struggling to meet their payments. And this all really, the American economy collapses in the spring of 1837. So this is months after Van Buren takes office. The Bank of England raises its discount rate. This is the sort of thing that has wide repercussions on the international economy. And a lot of the banks that have been financing the cotton market in the South, they start calling in their loans when these companies can't pay them, they withdraw their credit. We have a wave of closings, and this has enormous repercussions throughout the country. And on top of that, a lot of these banks, they are plumb out of specie. Why? Because for one reason is Andrew Jackson puts through this executive order saying any public lands purchased can only be purchased with coin. You can't buy any of this with paper money. So you want to buy some land during the transaction, you have to pay for it with specie. This leads to a real move. Specie is something that is moving toward the western part of the country because this is where all the land sales are taking place. Banks find themselves unable to redeem paper money with specie. They have to cut down this operation altogether. So what does it mean? It means people who've got paper money, it's worthless. They can't redeem this for any kind of specie. They're flat without money. So this is the sort of economic recession the nation had never seen at this stage, and it remains one of the great economic recessions of the 19th century in America. And Van Buren really struggles to come up with a response to this because, first of all, he doesn't have many options to begin with. It really comes down to politics. Is he willing to abandon Andrew Jackson's policies for the sake of his own administration? And he decides, no, that I'm going to stick with Jackson's policies. This will simmer down eventually. It actually does simmer down a little bit, but by then the damage was great, though. And this was something he never really quite recovers from. There's a second problem with species in the bank, and this happens in 1839. So this just turns out to be a perennial problem, that it starts off terribly, little bit of improvement, but then things go south again. So Van Buren can never quite establish a hold on the U.S. economy. And then there's the Indian removal. Do you want to get into that right now? I mean, the Indian Removal Act is passed in 1830. This is something that was really done at Jackson's behest. This is probably the one goal of his administration that he really took the lead on. And Van Buren was his strong ally on this. He was in complete agreement with them that the Indians had to be removed west of the Mississippi River. And when he becomes president, Van Buren, much had already been done, but of what they call the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, and the Cherokees. Of those 5, the Cherokees and the Seminoles were still in their. The Cherokees were still in Georgia. Seminoles were still in Florida. The Cherokees fought back in the legal arena. There was the famous case of Worcester versus Georgia, where Chief Justice Marshall sided with the Cherokees and said Georgia has to honor treaty obligations with the United States and allow the Cherokees to work within that framework, to remain where they were. But there was no enforcement mechanism for this sort of thing. Nothing really changed. Cherokee removal went ahead, and in 1838, Van Buren felt he was duty bound to follow through on the law that was Jackson's law, a law that was really integral to the Democratic Party right now, that there had to be an Indian removal policy enforced. And the Cherokee campaign, which was being administered by Winfield Scott, who was this prominent military leader in the United States, was really carried out in a brutal and horrific fashion. There were a series of delays, and Van Buren sends Scott down to Georgia to try to work out a removal plan with the Cherokees. But when Scott gets there, he gets frustrated at the sort of vacillating he sees coming from Washington on this issue. He takes charge. And in May of 1838, the U.S. Army swoops in on Georgia, on the Cherokee country, and they're all ordered out of their homes. They can't take their possessions with them. They can't even take a second set of clothes with them. They're put on boats. First they go to internment camps, and then they're sent out west. Thousands die of malnutrition, disease. There are horrific examples of mistreatment from the military, including stories of rape. It's really just a terrible chapter in U.S. history. And I think Van Buren, this is so associated with Andrew Jackson. And of course, Jackson was the leading force behind this. But some pretty awful atrocities took place under the Van Buren administration as well. And then there was the Seminole campaign, which the Second Seminole War begins under Jackson in 1835. And again, Van Buren has to continue with this. And even though the Seminoles were a small tribe, there were 5,000 of them, and they were deep in the swamplands of Florida. They posed no threat to anyone, and no one posed any threat to them. This wasn't land anyone desired. But this policy was so firmly entrenched in the country's political system at the time that it was just removal had to be carried out, no exceptions. That if you start making exceptions, this could lead to dangerous precedents. So the Seminole War was also one carried out where the U.S. Army came in, and there were all these battles that took place, and eventually the Seminoles were so depleted that they too had to go out west. So it wasn't until 1842, after Van Buren's presidency, that it was finally completed. And this, of course, would carry on for many years to come. But the Van Buren administration and the way removal policies were carried out then, I think, it's a side of this terrible saga that I don't think quite gets enough attention.
Mm. So let me ask, it seems as if Van Buren's mark as president was maybe not the best. And some maybe his fault, some things he carried out. But maybe what does get missed is him as a politician, as someone with developing parties, things like that. So I guess the last question I have here is what is, for him overall, but him as president as well, what do you think is a kind of a current take, if you will, or a current way of viewing Van Buren's legacy?
It's hard for us to separate parties from politics. That even somebody running for a small elected local office, and they call these nonpartisan elections, you're still wondering in the back of your mind, is this guy a Republican or a Democrat? And you hear people talking on television, and you start to wonder, which side is this guy on? It's so hard for us to separate these things. So how did parties become so dominant in our political life? Van Buren, for good and ill, I think, was in many ways profoundly influential in this. He was the guy there at the creation. He always had this highly romantic view of parties as being a way to keep citizens engaged, to keep them active. That knocking on doors and canvassing and getting involved in campaigns, and the newspapers. That was kind of his romantic view of political parties. I think we have less and less of that right now. So a lot of people are prone to look at parties sort of as an arm of the more noxious and destructive elements in our political life. So we think of parties now as an arm of corporations and other powerful people who are seeking to manipulate them for private gain. There's much to be said for that. So it's not so much a question of did he leave a terrible legacy for us? In many ways, he left a good legacy for us. That parties have become problematic in political life, I think, is a reflection of our current political culture, not so much the idea itself.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, I think that's important because, I mean, I think that there are many pragmatic and helpful elements of parties, and they will be there regardless whether you have 2 or 6 or whatever. So I do think his stamp on that is invaluable. I think it's something that is for at least for folks here in the U.S. So that's important. James, this was lots of fun. I really enjoyed.
I had a lot of fun too. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, you were you give a really nice way of giving a good narrative of things. Explained very well. The book is like that, so it's great. So. Big thanks for coming on and telling us about the 8th U.S. president.
Xavier, it's been my pleasure, and I thank you very much for inviting me on your show. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to speak.
Of course. Yes, thank you.